Hello there, mates. So we're going to keep talking about the civil rights movement and why it makes gains in post-war America, aren't we, yeah? And what we're going to find out here is that after that spark Rosa Parks gives us, and with MLK's vision that we talked about yesterday of using non-violent passive resistance to teach love, we're going to see a rapid growth in participation in the civil rights movement as it moves from the 1950s into the 1960s. And what we're going to see there is that this rapid growth of participation, this non-violent resistance, as it were, what we're going to see here is a willingness to provoke violence using peaceful methods. And I'll give you several examples here of how we're going to see this civil rights movement make gains by provoking this violence. That's the plan anyway. So we know that CORE, from our lesson yesterday, started out by breaking in these sit-ins in the North. But as the 1950s went on, their movement quickly grew throughout the 1950s into the 1960s. And their goal, as we talked about yesterday, was to end those Jim Crow laws. Now, just a quick reminder in case you've forgotten, Jim Crow were those laws that allowed segregation. It's the actual laws that segregate restaurants and schools and all these other public places that say certain people can only be here, everyone else has to be over there, and so on. And so we'll see CORE begin their southern sit-ins at places like Woolworths counters in Greensboro, North Carolina. And what happens there is that participation spreads so rapidly. From that one sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina in the late 1950s, in 2 months, CORE is going to see their sit-in spread to 54 different cities nationwide, protesting integrating facilities north and south. And here's the interesting thing. Success breeds success. When the Congress of Racial Equality begins to have success north and south, other people are going to want to get involved and participate in this civil rights movement. And the example that we want to look at would be when college students get involved, forming their own Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. And what's interesting here is that when it comes to just issues like Jim Crow for SNCC, it's not just about using these sit-ins to end Jim Crow laws, places like how, like this washing place that just washes for white people only. SNCC is much more interested in using their nonviolent passive resistance to provoke white violence. See, the rule here, the thought is, if we can provoke white violence, if we, as civil rights activists, students getting involved, as SNCC, if we can get a white person to beat us, to attack us, to degrade us in public, then we can show how wrong it is. There's no arguing how barbaric segregation really is. There's no arguing that it needs to end. SNCC would go to great lengths to try and help its people be ready to provoke violence by whites. This is a series of photographs that were taken at a SNCC training for its members to handle white violence. So even though there is a black person pulling the hair of another black person, this is actual training about how to have your hair yanked and pulled, about how to be hit, punched, degraded, and not fight back, not strike back, not yell back, to take the violence, to provoke it even more. Because if they can provoke that violence, then there can be no argument that those Jim Crow laws need to go, because they are completely out of touch and out of date with American society. One of the ways that CORE and SNCC will work together is by looking for ways to provoke this violence, and they decide on protesting against the interstate bus system. Why? The interstate bus system? It's an easy target, and it goes north to south. Here's how it works. White and African American riders, they become known as the Freedom Riders. What they're going to do is get on a bus and travel to the South to draw attention to the South's refusal to integrate bus terminals, because the Supreme Court said you can't segregate bus terminals. It's against the rules. You can't have a white-only bus terminal and a black-only bus terminal. No dice. So the Freedom Riders start in the North where there isn't much violence. And as they progress south, the violence increases. We're going to look at this tomorrow in more detail, but we'll see beatings begin to occur as the violence moves into the South. Here you can see a Klan rally where members of the Klan are beating Freedom Riders as they get off the bus. The violence will peak in places in the Deep South, like in Alabama, where the Freedom Riders bus is actually firebombed, where people flee the firebomb bus and are beaten savagely, severely, with the consent and the will of the police behind the attackers. President Kennedy, even though he had slowly moved on civil rights because he needs the help of Southern senators to get his New Frontier programs passed, is going to be forced to help these riders when the violence becomes that bad. Remember, if we can provoke violence serious enough, then you can't ignore it anymore. Eventually, Kennedy will order the Interstate Commerce Commission to tighten its regulations and put an end to these segregated bus terminals. It's a victory for the civil rights movement, for CORE, for SNCC. And this kind of provocation, this kind of provoke, it will continue in other places around America. And what we'll see is that America will have its violence and its will tested in places like Birmingham, Alabama, where civil rights workers with CORE and SNCC, under the vision of Martin Luther King, will protest, and they will see young children bombed and killed. And we're going to see society confronted with its guilt, with its willingness to let this kind of behavior go on. And we'll see finally then the government promoting change. Let me show you what I mean. With President Kennedy finally beginning to move on civil rights, you're going to see Martin Luther King, whose vision of nonviolent passive resistance, this issue of provoking violence to show how broken the system is, using love against hatred. King is going to decide to lead a protest in Birmingham, Alabama, right there, right at the heart of the Deep South, where racism is at its worst, because it will provoke violence in a way that we'll have never seen before. We'll see the dogs sicked on these protesters. We'll see people beaten, shot with fire hoses. And the goal is to get Kennedy to fully support civil rights. But what King doesn't expect is that before this protest can occur, the KKK targets a Baptist church in Birmingham and blows it up, killing 4 young children, and you can see them here. The protests will go on, that violence increasing in size. King himself is arrested in Birmingham, and he writes the letter from a Birmingham jail where he talks about, again, as we said in our lesson from the other day, that people are taught to hate us. We must use the weapon of love. There must be desegregation. There must be. This kind of violence, the death, the killing of kids, we can't be guilty of this. And society will begin to respond with these nonviolent demonstrations happening across the South. We're going to see activists killed again and again, like Medgar Evers, this man right here, killed by whites in Mississippi for speaking out against segregation. We see people killed and lynched for pushing for voting rights and so on. As we see court victories, as we see the success of desegregation efforts of CORE and SNCC, King will lead people on a march on Washington and will give his famous I Have a Dream speech in the summer of 1963. And then finally, bowing to this violence, bowing to the death, bowing to the guilt that we see in our society, President Kennedy will try to get a Civil Rights Act through Congress. He'll fail. Congress won't pass it. He's assassinated that fall. And LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and you can see him here in this image with Dr. Martin Luther King. There's LBJ, there's King. He is going to use Kennedy's death as a way to get a civil rights bill through Congress. And even though senators from the South try to filibuster it, they try to speak continuously to prevent a vote, it passes. In the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is one of the most important laws our country has ever passed, is made into law. And it does so many things. It makes segregation illegal in almost every public place. It promises equal access to all kinds of facilities and gives tremendous power to citizens who want to bring lawsuits to stop segregation where it still exists. And it finally says we cannot discriminate in private places of work. This is a huge, huge, huge deal where we finally begin to see the government take action in the face of all of this violence. Interestingly enough, once we get civil rights for African Americans, Dr. King and others will begin to push for voting rights, because think about it. You tell me I have equal rights, but when I go to exercise those rights, when I go to cast my ballot, to vote, to say I want to choose a politician that is not racist, you lynch me, you attack me, you kill me, you beat me. So King will say it's all well and good to have civil rights, but it's useless if we cannot enact them. We need voting rights. We'll see victories for this with the 24th Amendment that says we can no longer have a poll tax. But again, that's just a word. It's just words on a paper. It's not actually changing on the ground. We're not actually seeing African Americans being able to cast those votes. Robert Kennedy, former brother, well, still brother of JFK when he was alive and still brother when he's dead, he'll help African Americans register to vote by filing lawsuits throughout the South when he becomes Attorney General under LBJ. But even then, the pace of change is too slow. African Americans aren't able to exercise that vote that they have to have those equal rights, to make use of those equal rights. And so King and the other leaders of SNCC and CORE, they will say we must continue to protest, we must continue to provoke violence. And so what they say is we're going to march from Selma, Alabama to Birmingham, Alabama, there in the Deep South where the violence of the worst. And we're going to campaign for those voting rights. And we're going to see this march go from Selma, and you can see it there, whites and blacks together marching in unity from Selma to Birmingham. And we're going to see them cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Here they are crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge right outside Selma. And what we're going to see, more than 3,000 protesters arrested, and we're going to see them beaten, severely attacked, brutalized, run over with horses, beaten with clubs, live on TV. Live on TV. Images like this one go across the country in something known as Bloody Sunday, and LBJ becomes furious. He says, how is it that we as a country can let this happen live on TV? You cannot deny the violence when it's live, when you can see it everywhere. LBJ calls Congress together and he demands the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allows us to prosecute those people that will turn their backs on blacks trying to vote and who will hurt them and keep them from voting. And what we'll see once it's passed is 4 months, 250,000 African Americans registering to vote. And finally, blacks in Congress will go from 0 in 1965 to 44 by 2011. That is an amazing sense of progress. These laws, by these together, are the most crucial laws that we will pass, because until the mid-1960s, the civil rights movement had focused on these political rights, and it's crucial because they've obtained them. The passage of these acts, civil rights, voting rights, means that that focus on political rights has been achieved and won. And we'll talk about in further lessons what comes next.